Oh, yeah. So what we're talking about here is I'm trying to organize this in part around the branches of government, because one of your rubrics in your teaching is about branches of government and the relative power between them, and the civil rights era is a really nice way of thinking about that. So the Warren Court, and as I was suggesting a moment ago, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led by Thurgood Marshall, began to challenge separate but equal. Now, forgive me for those of you who are already in the first and second years, but the litigation, both the strategy and the issues at stake, are really interesting here. Right? So, the part of the Constitution that is at issue is the second of the three Reconstruction Amendments. Remember the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and equal protection of the law. It defines anyone who's born in the country as a citizen. That's a significant issue today, actually. In part to do away with the Dred Scott decision, which had defined black people as non-citizens. So the 14th Amendment defines that everyone born here is a citizen, and that every citizen is entitled to equal protection of the laws regardless of race, color, or prior condition of servitude. And then you have the 15th Amendment in 1870, which says the right to vote cannot be restricted based on race, color, or prior condition of servitude. And if you go back through our lectures last year, part of what I tried to show was how the 14th and 15th Amendments are not exactly nullified, but narrowed through a series of Supreme Court decisions which say, in the case of voting, for example, that you can't take people's right to vote based on race, color, or prior condition of servitude. That doesn't mean they have a right to vote. You can impose a poll tax. You can impose a literacy test. You can say, if your grandfather could vote, a so-called grandfather clause, you don't have to pay the poll tax. And when those kinds of devices pass muster with the Supreme Court in the early 1890s, and it's the Mississippi State Constitution of 1890 under which you still live that is the central test case, the so-called Mississippi Plan. When the Supreme Court says that the Mississippi Plan does not violate the 15th Amendment, enfranchising people without regard to race, color, prior condition of servitude, then all bets are off, and black people are driven out of the voting rolls nowhere more dramatically than in Mississippi, which through Reconstruction is sending people to the U.S. Senate and Congress who are black, and which by the early years of the 20th century, something only like 6 or 7% of black people in the state who would otherwise be eligible remain on the voting rolls. Well, the same thing happens in the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection of the laws, which you would think would mean you can't discriminate. There's a bunch of cases that restrict that in a variety of ways, but the most famous is the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, and you all know this, and even your students will know this, right? That basically says you have not violated the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection of the laws simply by segregating people, as long as those facilities are essentially, substantively equal. Now, as we know, that became a fig leaf for all kinds of racial discrimination. And you can just look at the amount of public funding that was going to black schools versus white schools. I don't have these figures in front of me, but I suspect in a state like Mississippi, it was probably 10 cents on the dollar for a black child compared to a white child. So these facilities were not equal by the furthest stretch of the imagination, but it basically was the fig leaf to proceed. Well, this is what the NAACP starts to attack. And interestingly enough, they don't initially attack the doctrine of separate but equal full frontal. They instead say, okay, if the law of the land is separate but equal, we're going to make you actually do it. Now this gets tricky. Suppose, for example, that a state university has graduate programs in physics and is building a cyclotron for them. Does that mean if a black person in your state also wants to study physics in graduate school, you have to build a separate cyclotron? Good luck with this. What most states did throughout the middle decades of the 20th century was they simply gave that black person money to go out of state, so they didn't have to deal with it. The NAACP lawyers see the hole there, and they move in. And they begin to bring a series of cases, and I've picked these two because these are in your textbook as significant cases. Sweat v. Painter applies to Texas. University of Texas has a law school. Well, Texas is a big place, and there's some black people who want to go to law school too, so they set up a separate black law school. And the NAACP brings that case and says these facilities aren't equal. And the Supreme Court agrees. They say part of an equal education in law school is its reputation, is the network of contacts and alumni you have. And of course, Supreme Court justices know how that works in law school. These facilities are not equal. Therefore, this is a violation of the 14th Amendment, and you have to admit black law students to the University of Texas. Same thing happens in McLaurin versus Oklahoma. The case is brought about at the same time. They have a black student who's doing a PhD in education. They try to send him out of state, somewhere north. He didn't want to do it. He wants to do it in Oklahoma. So what they do as separate but equal is they have the class like this. You can see that you can find his pictures on the web. And he has to sit in a chair outside the room. And the NAACP rules that is not separate but equal. You have to let him in the room. So part of what's happening, again, the Cold War context is significant here. The progress towards at least formal acknowledgement of black civil rights by Truman's Committee on Civil Rights, Presidential Committee, and so forth. In this context, the Supreme Court is also beginning to move in this direction. Finally, by 1954, the NAACP realizes that the court's ready for a direct assault on Jim Crow. They take 5 school segregation cases, they're consolidated in the Brown decision, and the Supreme Court, something courts don't do very often, renounces its own earlier decision, says separate but equal is inherently unequal. It is, celebrated and rightly as one of the real triumphs of civil rights and one of the forces that provided impetus for the movement to come. Now it's worth pointing out, and people in Mississippi know this, that didn't mean that schools got integrated immediately. Recognizing that this was really controversial, recognizing that there would be a lot of resistance, uncertain what would happen if people simply defied the Supreme Court, the court initially imposes no timetable. It asks the two sides to come back the next year with arguments about how to implement the decision. And in that decision, so-called Brown 2, the court comes up with the doctrine that integration shall proceed with all deliberate speed, which in most southern states meant very, very, very slowly. And it's really only another case in 1969 where the court says, you know what, it's been 15 years, that's long enough. And it's in 1970 that the state of Mississippi integrates school children for the first time. It's also then, immediately after that, that the rise of private academies, again, this is one of these, even our language is politicized. Seg academies, Christian academies, private schools. You can tell a lot about somebody's politics by what they call them, right? That those things proliferate. And I don't have to talk to you about the state of racial integration or segregation in the state of Mississippi because you all know it way, way more than I. So the significance of this chain of legal decisions isn't so much that suddenly people are in school together, although in some places that does affect them. Instead, it confirms, as the presidential executive orders confirm, that the federal government is increasingly aligned with the cause of civil rights, at least symbolically and rhetorically. Now, people who believed in civil rights would be quick to tell you that the federal government wasn't doing a hell of a lot to actually make it happen. But at least symbolically, the federal government, in two of its three branches, is aligning itself with the cause of racial integration, of civil rights, and aligning itself in opposition to southern states and what Southerners describe as their distinctive way of life, what white Southerners describe as their way of life. There's a reason why opposition to civil rights in places like Mississippi will be articulated in the language of states' rights. And it's articulated in the language of states' rights because the federal government is now on the other side. And forgive me for being cynical about states' rights arguments, because I said this to you last year, the year before. You know, if the subject is gun control, I'm for states' rights. If my state wants to impose an ordinance, they should be able to. And all these so-called conservatives say, no, you can't, right? There's a constitutional guarantee. Whether you're for states' rights on a particular issue usually depends on which side of the issue that you're on and which side the federal government's on. And what's happened through this process, through that first decade after the Second World War, in the context of the Cold War, is the federal government has been at least symbolically annexed as an ally of the cause of civil rights. Not doing a lot. And Lord knows it's uneven. And while all this is happening, you've got the FBI, which is doing surveillance on civil rights activists because J. Edgar Hoover believes, or at least says he believes, they're communists. So it's a messy, muddy picture. But at least at a symbolic or rhetorical level, white Southerners begin to find themselves stigmatized as somehow standing outside the American way of life. It is in that context that this person, you've probably heard of her, enters the scene. Everybody knows Rosa Parks, but we don't know much. You know, one of the ways you can tell what stories Americans tell about history is read children's books. So I had a student some years ago went to the library and got all the children's books about Rosa Parks. And they're all just wrong. I remember one of them began, Rosa Parks was not a political activist. She was a simple seamstress whose feet were tired. Well, bullshit, actually. Rosa Parks was a political activist. Rosa Parks had been drawn into politics during the Second World War following a brutal rape of a black woman by a mob of whites, a woman named Recky Taylor. And black women in that city established a thing called the Committee for Equal Justice for Recky Taylor. Many of those women then went on to found an organization called the Women's Political Council. And it was the Women's Political Council that was the driving force of the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks was also a member of, indeed secretary to the head of, the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. This was a veteran political activist. Martin Luther King, the figure who we think, I don't mean to diminish King in any way, as who becomes the symbol of the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King's 25 years old. He just arrived in town. And the reason he becomes head of the Montgomery Improvement Association is that the veteran political activists in there recognize that he's the only local minister who hasn't been in town long enough to be in the pocket of the power structure. Martin doesn't make the move. The movement makes Martin. Now, let it be said, and this is a picture, I believe, of the Holt Street Baptist Church the day after the first day of the boycott. It's going to be a one-day symbolic boycott. It became almost a year boycott when the decision is made to continue. And if you read the speech that Martin Luther King knocked up in about 10 minutes before going off to that to that meeting, you realize that they found the right person. But again, it's a different way of telling the story. This church, by the way, is now a dilapidated ruin because when they put in the interstate road system, it stands right inside a highway cloverleaf, an interstate cloverleaf, which cut it off from the surrounding community, and now it's fallen down, and that's a travesty.